So you can find that statement.
No, I understand.
See, she don't want to answer. She refusing to protect Caitlin Clark. You got up there, you had a bunch to say for Alyssa Thomas. But when it comes to Caitlin Clark, you don't have nothing to say.
Imagine building the most valuable asset your franchise has ever seen, watching her sell out arenas from coast to coast, witnessing her single-handedly drag your organization from irrelevance into the national spotlight, and then responding to questions about her safety with a shrug and a deflection. That's exactly what's happening in Indiana right now. Caitlin Clark didn't just join the Fever, she resurrected them. She transformed a forgotten franchise into a cultural phenomenon overnight.
This was Amber Cox on Twitter or X, whichever you call it. Fever fans, we appreciate you. Can't thank you enough for always showing up for us at home and on the road. We hear you and are incredibly grateful for the support. This is after an Indiana Fever win versus the Phoenix Mercury. She posted this, okay? And then a fan account said,
"Don't forget." She filled seats, broke records, shattered viewership numbers, and made casual sports fans care about women's basketball for the first time in years. By every measurable standard, she is the most impactful thing that has ever happened to that organization. So why does it feel like the Indiana Fever are trying to manage Caitlin Clark rather than celebrate her? Why is the head coach deflecting questions about congressional concern for Clark's safety? Why is the general manager getting into social media arguments with fan accounts? Why is the player who changed everything about this franchise being defended less passionately than anyone else on the roster? The answers are uncomfortable, revealing, and absolutely worth examining. There's a specific moment that crystallized everything fans and critics had been whispering about for months.
We're trying to get more young women, talented women, into professional sports. Young women in my district are aspiring to someday get in the WNBA, and we want to provide a safe place for them to play, no matter their race, no matter their really anything but their ability to play. And Caitlin Clark, it's quite evident, especially recently, that this type of abuse coming from some players in the WNBA has gotten worse. This is the moment where they put a fist on her throat while she is pinned to the court. I think it's unacceptable. I think a fifth grader looking at the video, a compilation of the video that has happened to Caitlin Clark over the last couple of years, would readily see that this type of behavior is unacceptable.
It happened at a Fever press conference when a reporter asked Stephanie White a simple but loaded question. Congressional representatives had sent a formal letter to WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert expressing concern about what they described as potential civil rights violations targeting Caitlin Clark. The question to White was straightforward. How does the organization respond to that kind of scrutiny? How does a head coach handle the situation when members of Congress are formally raising alarms about the treatment of one of her players? White's response was immediate and telling. She referenced a team statement that had already been released and suggested reporters could find it on their own.
Hello, David. I will just say this. We have to be very careful about how we look at player voting when it comes to the All-Star vote, right? They comprise 25% of the vote, the media 25%, the fans 50%. Now, of a pool of 180 roster players, you've got 85 of them voting, so it's a small sample size. So you have players, for instance, guys that are voting for, hey, my teammate, my buddy, I can vote for my entire roster, the team I play on. But I do think you certainly have a pool of players who take this thing seriously. And while some may not take it seriously, it is a small sample size. You see 11th with Caitlin Clark, and it is insulting. It is preposterous to consider she would be even deemed worthy of or unworthy of being in a conversation of the 11th best guard in the WNBA. And frankly, to further the discourse, to consider the fact that some believe that she's not even worthy of being in the top four or being a starter amongst these all-star players is to me foolishness.
I agree 1,000%. Pure foolishness. But
She indicated that the matter wasn't something the organization planned to address beyond that brief statement. She wrapped the deflection in language about focusing on what the team could control and keeping the main thing the main thing. Watch that moment carefully, and you'll see something beyond just a coach trying to avoid a difficult question. You'll see an organization that has made a calculated decision to stay as far away from this controversy as possible, even when that controversy directly involves the physical safety and professional treatment of their most valuable player. The reporter didn't let it go easily. The follow-up essentially called out the contrast directly. When Aaliyah Thomas needed defending, Stephanie White didn't reference a team statement and move on. She gave passionate, detailed, heartfelt responses about inclusiveness, about protecting players, about the values of the organization and the league. She spoke at length and with genuine emotion about what it means to stand up for someone who's being treated unfairly.
Don't forget
But when
to
the player in question is Caitlin Clark, when Congress is sending formal letters about potential civil rights issues, when video evidence of physical targeting has been compiled and presented to league officials, suddenly
y'all might as well just get rid of her. Just get rid of Caitlin Clark at this point. Indiana Fever, Amber Cox, Stephanie White, y'all clearly don't value her. Y'all clearly want to go in another direction. Y'all just don't want to deal with the backlash from the fan base that is going to come with it. But y'all made it very obvious. Y'all drawn a line in the sand and shown what side y'all are standing on. We got Amber Cox pissed at Caitlin Clark fans for calling out how happy she is after wins without her, and she's not like that when Caitlin Clark is doing her thing and they're winning games. She's mad that fans are calling her out. Stephanie White is mad at the letter from Congress. This is all crazy. They don't want to deal with this stuff. So I think it's in the...
Stephanie White doesn't have much to say beyond pointing reporters toward a press release. The contrast isn't subtle. It's impossible to miss once you see it, and fans have absolutely seen it. If Stephanie White's press conference deflection was striking, Amber Cox's social media behavior has been equally revealing, though in a different way. Cox posted what appeared to be a routine thank you message to Fever fans after a win against the Phoenix Mercury. Standard public relations content, the kind of post that franchises make all the time to maintain engagement with their fan base. Grateful for the support, we hear you, thank you for showing up. Nothing unusual on the surface. But fans who had been paying attention noticed something. They'd been tracking Cox's social media activity throughout the season, and a pattern had emerged. When the Fever won games without Clark's dominant contribution, Cox was visibly enthusiastic on social media, celebratory and actively engaged. When the Fever won games with Clark leading the charge, Cox's public response was noticeably more measured and restrained. A fan account called it out directly, posting the observation publicly and essentially challenging Cox to acknowledge what fans were seeing. Here's where things get genuinely strange. Instead of doing what virtually every professional executive would do in that situation, which is ignore a fan account's criticism entirely, Cox fired back defensively. She engaged with the account, disputed the characterization, and tried to reframe the narrative. Think about what that response actually reveals. Amber Cox is the general manager of a professional basketball team. She has a full-time staff, media relations professionals, and institutional experience in how organizations manage public perception. When a general manager of any major sports franchise gets drawn into a public argument with a fan account on social media, it means one of two things. Either the criticism is so wildly off base that it demands correction, or the criticism hit close enough to home that the instinct to defend overrode the professional judgment to simply disengage. Given everything else happening around the Fever organization, it doesn't require much analysis to figure out which scenario applies here. Cox's response itself is also worth examining closely. She defended Clark's status as a teammate. She pushed back on the narrative that her celebration of wins changes based on who leads the team, all technically defensible positions. But the act of responding, the choice to engage rather than ignore, tells its own story. If there was genuinely nothing to the observation fans were making, a professional executive lets it pass without acknowledgement. The fact that Cox couldn't let it pass suggests the observation touched something real. To understand the full scope of what's happening, you have to understand exactly what prompted congressional involvement, because this wasn't politicians grandstanding about something they hadn't researched. Congressman Jeff Duncan went on record with specific, detailed concerns backed by visual evidence. He wasn't speaking in generalities about rough play or competitive basketball. He was describing a specific incident where Clark was pinned to the court and a fist was placed on her throat. He was talking about compiled video evidence showing a pattern of behavior that, in his words, a fifth grader could look at and immediately identify as unacceptable. Duncan's framing was also deliberately chosen. He positioned this as a matter affecting young women in his district who aspire to play professional basketball. He talked about wanting to ensure the league provides a safe environment for players regardless of race or any characteristic beyond their ability to play. He was raising Title IX concerns, civil rights concerns, and workplace safety concerns simultaneously. This is not a fringe position from conspiracy-minded fans reading too much into hard fouls. This is an elected official presenting compiled video documentation to the league commissioner and formally asking why these incidents aren't being addressed adequately. This is the kind of scrutiny that carries actual institutional weight and demands substantive responses. The WNBA's response has been largely characterized by the same kind of deflection we've seen from the Fever organization. Platitudes about player safety, references to existing policies, and a general desire to move past the conversation as quickly as possible without making any concrete commitments to change. And the Fever's contribution to this response was a brief team statement that Stephanie White declined to elaborate on when asked directly. For fans who have watched Clark get knocked down, fouled hard, targeted physically throughout the season, and who have watched the officiating fail to adequately protect her, the organizational response feels like abandonment. They're not asking for special treatment. They're asking for the same level of passionate advocacy that other players receive when their treatment becomes a legitimate public concern. They're asking Stephanie White to respond to questions about Clark's safety with the same energy she brings when defending other members of her roster. That's not an unreasonable expectation, and the fact that it hasn't been met is driving the increasingly intense frustration within the Fever fan base.
Don't forget
While
to subscribe
all of this
and turn on the
organizational tension was
notification
building,
bell so you
the
never miss a video.
WNBA All-Star player voting added another dimension to the story that's impossible to ignore in this context. The voting breakdown matters. Fans comprise 50% of the All-Star vote, media comprises 25%, players comprise the remaining 25%. Of approximately 180 roster players eligible to vote, only 85 actually participated. That's already a significant abstention rate that raises questions about how seriously players across the league take the process. Among those who did vote, Caitlin Clark came in 11th among guards. 11th. Take a moment to sit with that number in the context of everything Clark has done this season. The record-breaking attendance figures, the sellout road games in arenas that had never sold out for women's basketball before, the jersey sales that have shattered every previous benchmark, the viewership numbers that have made networks and advertisers reconsider their entire approach to WNBA broadcasting rights. The national media attention that has made casual sports fans aware of the league in ways they simply weren't before Clark arrived. The player who has done more for WNBA visibility and financial growth than anyone in the league's recent history, ranked 11th among guards in player voting. To be fair, the voting process has complications. Some players vote for teammates and friends as a matter of loyalty. Some treat the process as informal. The small sample size of 85 voters out of 180 eligible players means a handful of strategic or spiteful votes can significantly move the needle. Media personality David Jacoby analyzed this carefully and called the 11th place ranking insulting and preposterous when evaluated honestly against what Clark's actual performance numbers deserve. But here's the thing, even accounting for all those complications, even understanding that some votes are cast for teammates rather than on pure merit, the 11th place ranking still reflects something real about how a meaningful portion of Clark's fellow players view her status in the league. They don't think she deserves to be recognized as a starter or even a top-tier all-star selection, regardless of what every objective metric says. And that attitude, that resistance to acknowledging what Clark actually brings to the table, exists in the same environment where she's getting physically targeted in ways that draw congressional attention, and where her own organization seems reluctant to defend her publicly. These things are connected. The culture that produces the all-star voting outcome is the same culture that produces the physical targeting, the same culture that makes it complicated for Fever management to take strong public stands on Clark's behalf. It's all part of the same ecosystem of resistance to fully embracing what Caitlin Clark represents and what she's bringing to the league. Understanding why the Fever are behaving this way requires understanding the impossible position they've created for themselves. Amber Cox became general manager in October of 2023. Stephanie White was hired as head coach in November of 2024. Both came into their roles inheriting years of organizational mediocrity and a fan base that had largely disengaged from the team. Then the franchise landed the #1 overall pick in the 2024 draft and selected Caitlin Clark. What happened next was beyond anything either of them could have fully anticipated. The franchise didn't just improve, it transformed overnight into one of the most talked about teams in women's sports history. Arenas sold out, national media descended, merchandise flew off shelves, the organization's estimated valuation jumped dramatically, every metric associated with the franchise's health and visibility improved substantially and quickly. This should be an unambiguous celebration. This should be the kind of organizational moment that gets framed as a before and after turning point for decades. Before Clark, the Fever were a struggling franchise in a mid-sized market trying to stay relevant. After Clark, they're a national story. Instead, Cox and White seem to be experiencing the organizational version of culture shock. They came in prepared to manage a team that operated below the radar, making decisions without anyone particularly scrutinizing them. They were equipped to run a franchise where the occasional critical article or upset fan was the extent of accountability they'd face. What they weren't prepared for was a world where millions of people are tracking their social media activity, analyzing their press conference responses, scrutinizing every lineup decision, and now watching congressional representatives formally address concerns about their star players' treatment. The instinct when you're unprepared for that level of scrutiny is to manage it down, to deflect, to minimize, to try to get through each news cycle without making anything worse. That's what we're seeing from both Cox and White. They're not trying to make the situation worse. They're trying to survive it without creating new controversies. But the problem with that approach is that managing down scrutiny about Caitlin Clark doesn't actually reduce the scrutiny. It intensifies it. Every deflection becomes a story. Every careful non-answer becomes evidence of a pattern. Every instance of advocating passionately for one player while offering lukewarm responses about another gets documented and compared. The Fever organization has trapped itself. They can't ignore Clark because the financial consequences would be devastating. They can't fully embrace everything that comes with her because they're not organizationally prepared to operate at that level of public accountability. So they're stuck in the middle, doing just enough to avoid catastrophe while consistently doing less than what fans, media, and now Congress believe the situation requires. There's another dimension to this story that deserves honest examination, even though it's more uncomfortable to discuss directly. The Fever aren't operating in isolation. They're part of a broader WNBA culture that has shown mixed responses to everything Clark represents. Some players and teams have embraced her arrival enthusiastically, recognizing that rising tides lift all boats and that Clark's ability to grow the league's audience benefits everyone financially. Other players and teams have responded with what can most charitably be described as complicated feelings. Stephanie White has a locker room to manage. That locker room includes players who existed in the league before Clark arrived, who built careers and identities as professional basketball players during years when the league operated very differently, with smaller audiences, less media attention, and different internal hierarchies. Clark's arrival didn't just change the fan base, it changed the internal dynamics of the team and the league in ways that are still being negotiated. When White gives passionate defenses of players like Aaliyah Thomas, she's also managing the locker room relationships that determine whether a team functions cohesively. When she deflects questions about Clark and congressional letters, she may be making a calculation about which relationships require active maintenance and which can absorb some public criticism. That doesn't make it right. A head coach's most fundamental responsibility is to advocate for her players, all of them, consistently and without visible favoritism in either direction. If White is willing to go to the mat publicly for some players while deflecting for others, that inconsistency has consequences for team chemistry, for public perception, and for Clark's relationship with the organization long-term. But understanding the calculation White might be making doesn't require endorsing it. It just means recognizing that what appears to be simple favoritism or bias might also be the result of someone trying to manage competing loyalties within an organization that hasn't fully figured out how to integrate an unprecedented situation. The problem is that the consequences of getting that calculation wrong fall disproportionately on Clark. She's the one getting targeted physically. She's the one who the player voting puts at 11th despite her performance metrics. She's the one whose safety is now a congressional concern. And she's the one whose head coach responds to questions about that concern by pointing reporters toward a press release. Whatever internal calculations are happening within the organization, the external manifestation is an athlete who doesn't appear to have the full-throated institutional support that her situation demands. Here's where this situation becomes genuinely complicated beyond just organizational dysfunction and coaching decisions. The Fever cannot afford in any practical financial sense to lose Caitlin Clark. The numbers are stark and undeniable. Season ticket renewals, corporate sponsorship deals. National television broadcast agreements, merchandise revenue, and the franchise's overall market valuation are all substantially tied to Clark's continued presence on the roster. When fans in the frustrated corner of the internet suggest that the Fever should just trade Clark and let her go to Los Angeles or Toronto, or wherever else might benefit from her talents, they're expressing real emotional frustration with an organization they feel is taking a generational talent for granted. But they're also describing a scenario that would constitute organizational financial suicide. Trading Clark would trigger immediate and catastrophic consequences. Season ticket holders would demand refunds. Sponsors who signed deals specifically because of Clark's presence and the audience she brings would exercise exit clauses. National television packages would evaporate. The organizations that schedule road games expecting sold-out arenas because Clark is coming to town would lose that revenue stream. The franchise's valuation would crater. The Fever need Caitlin Clark far more than Clark needs the Fever. As a player who's already made herself one of the most marketable athletes in women's sports, Clark has options. A trade request, if she were ever motivated to make one, would generate bidding wars from teams desperate to access everything she brings to a franchise. The Fever, without Clark, go back to being what they were before the 2024 draft. A struggling mid-market team that occasionally competes but rarely dominates national conversation. This financial reality makes the organizational dysfunction even more puzzling. They know they need her. They know the numbers. They can see the attendance figures and the jersey sales and the merchandise revenue and the television ratings. And yet the behavior of Cox and White suggests an organization that hasn't fully committed to the mindset of building everything around maximizing that asset. They want the financial benefits of having Clark without the cultural and accountability adjustments that come with those benefits. That's not a sustainable position, and the cracks in it are becoming increasingly visible with every deflected press conference question and every defensive social media engagement. It's worth being specific about what fans and critics are actually asking for, because sometimes these conversations get framed as demands for special treatment or unrealistic expectations. What would it actually look like if the Fever organization were fully, authentically committed to supporting Caitlin Clark the way her situation demands? It would look like Stephanie White when asked about congressional concern regarding Clark's physical safety, responding with the same energy and detail she brings to defending other players. It doesn't require attacking the league or making inflammatory accusations. It requires saying clearly and without deflection that the organization takes the safety of all its players seriously, that Clark deserves to play in an environment where dangerous physical targeting is addressed by officials and by the league, and that the Fever will continue to advocate for better protection of their players through appropriate channels. That's not a complicated or controversial position. It's the kind of thing any coach should be able to say without hesitation about any player on their roster. It would look like Amber Cox's social media activity reflecting consistent, genuine enthusiasm for what the franchise is accomplishing with Clark on the floor, not because fans are demanding performative celebration, but because the metrics genuinely justify enthusiasm. It would look like the organization being proactive rather than reactive in addressing concerns about Clark's treatment, not waiting for congressional letters to arrive before acknowledging that physical targeting is a pattern worth addressing. It would look like building offensive systems and personnel decisions around maximizing what Clark does best, rather than trying to balance her talents against maintaining internal peace with players and factions within the organization that might prefer a different approach. None of these things are extraordinary asks. They're the baseline expectations that come with having a superstar on your roster. Every organization that has successfully built around a generational talent has made these kinds of commitments. The Fever's inability or unwillingness to make them is what's driving the perception that they're trying to manage Clark rather than celebrate her. The Fever's organizational challenges don't exist in a vacuum. They reflect tensions that exist throughout the league, tensions that Clark's arrival has brought to the surface after years of existing below public visibility. The WNBA has experienced genuinely unprecedented growth this season, and the evidence overwhelmingly points to Clark as the primary catalyst for that growth. The league has more media attention, more corporate interest, better broadcast deals, and higher attendance than at any point in recent memory. By any objective measure, Clark has been the most significant thing to happen to the league's visibility and commercial appeal in years. But that growth has exposed fault lines that the league would prefer not to examine too closely. Questions about how physical play is officiated differently for different players. Questions about whether internal league culture is resistant to the kind of mainstream crossover success that Clark represents. Questions about whether the league's response to concerns about player safety is adequate when the player in question attracts the kind of national attention Clark does. The WNBA, like the Fever, seems caught between two worlds. They want the financial benefits of Clark's popularity. They want the expanded television deals, the increased sponsorship interest, the broader cultural relevance. But they don't want the scrutiny that comes with it, particularly scrutiny that asks uncomfortable questions about whether the league's existing culture is compatible with the kind of mainstream success Clark is generating. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert is going to have to provide a substantive response to the congressional letter that goes beyond the kind of careful institutional language that avoids saying anything definitive. The letter represents a formal escalation of concerns that have been building throughout the season, and responding to it with platitudes will only intensify the criticism. The Fever are the focal point of all this tension because Clark is their player. Whatever happens with officiating policy, player conduct standards, and league culture more broadly, the Fever are the team that has to manage the day-to-day reality of having the league's most scrutinized player on their roster.
So you never miss a video.
And so far, the evidence suggests they're managing it primarily as a liability rather than embracing it as the extraordinary opportunity it actually represents. Predicting how this situation resolves requires understanding what incentives are driving each of the key players. Clark's incentive is straightforward. She wants to win. She wants to play in an environment where her talents are maximized and where she's protected from targeting that goes beyond competitive basketball. She wants to develop as a player and compete for championships. If the Fever provide that environment, she'll continue to be one of the most valuable assets in women's sports. If they don't, the calculus changes over time as she develops leverage within the league's player movement ecosystem. Cox's incentive is organizational survival and success. She wants to be recognized as a general manager who built something meaningful, who made smart decisions that resulted in a competitive and financially successful franchise. Right now, the clearest path to that recognition runs directly through maximizing everything Clark brings to the team. Whether Cox fully recognizes that path and is willing to make the organizational adjustments it requires remains an open question. White's incentive is coaching success. She wants to build a team that competes at the highest level, that respects her leadership, and that plays the kind of basketball she believes in. Integrating a player as uniquely talented and uniquely scrutinized as Clark into a cohesive team culture is genuinely challenging, and White's approach to that challenge will largely determine whether her tenure in Indiana is remembered as a success or a missed opportunity. The most likely short-term trajectory is a continuation of the uneasy status quo. The Fever keep Clark because the financial alternative is unthinkable. Cox and White continue navigating the tension between maximizing Clark's impact and managing the various competing interests within and around the organization. The scrutiny continues, intensified by the congressional letter and whatever response the league provides. But the medium-term trajectory depends entirely on whether the Fever make a genuine organizational commitment to building around Clark in the way that her talents and market value demand. If they do, the potential upside is enormous. A franchise built authentically around Caitlin Clark, with organizational culture, coaching philosophy, and personal decisions all aligned to maximize what she does, would be one of the most compelling stories in professional basketball for the next decade. If they continue trying to thread the needle between capitalizing on Clark's value and avoiding the accountability that comes with it, the tension will eventually become untenable. Not because Clark will force a trade demand tomorrow, but because the slow accumulation of organizational dysfunction always reaches a breaking point eventually. And when it does in a situation this high profile, the consequences are significant. In the midst of all this organizational analysis, social media scrutiny, and congressional attention, it's worth remembering that there's a human being at the center of all this.
And turn on the notification
Caitlin Clark is a young woman playing professional basketball in her first seasons in the league. She's navigating the physical demands of professional competition, the adjustment to a much higher level of play than anything she faced in college, and the extraordinary pressure of being the most scrutinized player in the history of women's professional basketball. She's doing all of this while also being physically targeted in ways that have drawn congressional attention, while watching video of herself being pinned to the court make national news, while knowing that her fellow players in an anonymous voting process placed her 11th when the objective evidence of her performance suggests she belongs in the top tier. And she's doing it without the kind of full-throated organizational support that would make any of this easier to navigate. The fans who are most vocal about the Fever's organizational failures aren't just angry about metrics and franchise valuations. They're concerned about a player they've invested in emotionally, who has given everything she has to make her team and her league better, and who seems to be operating without the institutional backing that any athlete in her position deserves. When Stephanie White gave passionate defenses of Aaliyah Thomas, she was doing something important. She was signaling to Thomas that the organization stood behind her. She was telling the player publicly that her coach had her back. That signal matters enormously for a player's confidence, her sense of security, and her ability to compete without having to worry about whether her organization is in her corner. Caitlin Clark should have that same signal. She should be able to play knowing that when questions arise about her safety and her treatment, her coach and her general manager will defend her as passionately and publicly as they would defend any other player. The fact that she doesn't appear to have that signal is what makes this organizational story more than just a business analysis. It's a story about whether an organization is doing right by a human being who's giving everything she has to succeed.
The notification bell so
The
you
Indiana
never miss a
Fever
video.
are standing at a crossroads that will define their franchise for the next decade and potentially longer. They possess the most transformative player in women's basketball history, a generational talent who has already changed everything about their organization's visibility, financial health, and cultural relevance. The question isn't whether they appreciate what Caitlin Clark brings in a general sense. They almost certainly do. The question is whether they're willing to make the organizational, cultural, and personal commitments that fully supporting her requires. Deflecting press conference questions with references to team statements isn't support. Getting defensive on social media with fan accounts isn't leadership. Staying silent when Congress raises formal concerns about your players' safety isn't neutrality. It's absence.
Don't forget to subscribe.
Clark deserves better than
notification
absence.
bell so
She
you never
deserves
miss
the
a
same
video.
passionate advocacy that every other player on that roster receives. She deserves an organization that matches her ambition and commitment with institutional support that's visible, consistent, and unmistakable. The Fever have an extraordinary opportunity in front of them. They can be the organization that built something legendary around one of basketball's greatest talents, or they can be remembered as the team that had everything and couldn't get out of their own way. The choice is entirely theirs to make.